All right, well, we're going to switch tracks here just a little bit. We've got one final group of speakers that are going to be joining us, and the topic is water, which is an important one and has been a top discussion, it sounds like, here for the state of South Dakota over the past few years. We're going to be bringing up 3 different panelists, and they're going to be sharing their thoughts with us here each individually, and then we'll be coming back together as a group to answer any questions you might have here later on. So again, if you've got any questions, be sure to utilize that Zoom chat button or text in your questions to us, and we'll be making sure we get those answered. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Michelle Burke, who is the Acting State Conservationist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in South Dakota. She was born and raised in Centerville, South Dakota, and began her career with NRCS during her college stint in 1990. She later became the Assistant State Conservationist for Field Operations in the Brookings area in 2015. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michelle.
All right, well, thank you, Delaney. Pleasure to be with everybody today. The subject, as you mentioned, is water, and we'll get off to a good start with that. For those of you who may not be very familiar with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, we do provide one-on-one personalized advice to farmers and ranchers and help them make investments on their land to help with sustainability. And one of the things that we do is we provide a variety of services. We have many different staff on board, whether it's engineers, technicians, agronomists, range management specialists, soil scientists, all that are specialized and can provide good advice. And that's one of the key things that we can offer is that one-on-one planning advice, ideas, talk through different scenarios right on your farm. So our folks do that every day and have a great deal of experience. All right, if we can get that to advance, thank you. Just to talk a little bit about the past year, obviously 2020 was quite an interesting year for many reasons. We did try and capture some of the accomplishments over the past year, and I do have those listed out here. Our staff across South Dakota planned with farmers and ranchers on over 1 million acres of land. So that means they went out one-on-one with them, looked at the resources, looked at any concerns, talked about ideas, and wrote up a conservation plan to do some best management practices. And just to give you a sense of what 1 million acres is, it's about the equivalent of 2 Minnehaha counties. So that's that much land scattered across the state in 1 year. So, and also as a result of that and prior years' planning, we were able to work with producers to implement 43,000 conservation practices on 1.7 million acres of land. And of those practices, they were of quite a variety, over 100 different types of practices, anything from infrastructure, whether that be pipelines, tanks on grazing land, fences, or on the crop side, it could have been cover crops, rotational crop rotations, waterways, terraces, just a variety of different practices. And to accomplish that, we do, of course, offer financial assistance, and we obligated $50 million in contracts, over 700 total contracts between our Environmental Quality Incentives Program, our Conservation Stewardship Program, and our easement programs. In addition to that, we do have 3,400 existing contracts that are managed at the same time. And this past year was a very big year in CRP. Nationally and definitely in South Dakota. We were one of the states that probably led the nation in the amount of CRP, and our staff planned on nearly 500,000 acres of CRP, 4,600 approved offers. So that was definitely a high in the nation, and when you think about it, a lot of those offers are very small parcels of land. It could be anywhere from 10 acres, 20 acres, maybe 40 acres. So it takes a lot of effort to get to 500,000. And of course, like everyone else, we were dealing with the impacts of COVID, which affected how we worked with producers on a daily basis. We were able to find some workarounds and ended up talking to people remotely, meeting in parking lots, meeting out in the field, whatever it took to get the job done. All right, so that was a little recap. And we're talking about water today, but from our agency's perspective, we can't hardly talk about water without talking about soil. When we're talking about water, a lot of people are thinking about flooding, some people are thinking about water quality, and soil has an impact on all of that. The amount of organic matter has a great bearing on the amount of water that's stored in your soil, especially for drought years, like this past fall got a little dry, and it looks like this upcoming year might be a little dry as well. So it's very important in that aspect, and also the residue on the surface is important to protect the soil surface so the most lucrative part of your soil on the surface doesn't get displaced and washed downstream. Just added a few pictures here. This is one that has been circulating for a few years. It's a very distinct fence line contrast. It is not photoshopped. This is a piece of ground just a few miles from my office in Brookings County. And you can definitely see the difference in management styles from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. And we have worked with the producer that operates the land on the left side of the screen, and we, over the past number of years, we worked with SDSU to help with a soils class and teach the students a little bit about best management practices and the differences in management and how that affects runoff. So we do calculate that and show them the difference between say a conventional till crop and something with higher residue, or perhaps looking at other practices such as terraces, waterways, and whatnot. All right. So one of the other things that we do tend to see is if we aren't able to do a good job of keeping the water where it lands on the field, and it does tend to run off, then we do help producers with some of the consequences of that, which you can see here in a pretty deep gully, and this is not too far west of where we're at today, so it's about an hour's drive away from where we're at, and you can see the effects of the runoff. So usually when we're out working with producers on a situation like this, we're also talking about, well, what is there something that you'd be interested in doing to trap the water where it lands, improve your soil health, and increase your amount of residue to prevent as much water from running off and creating an issue like this, because a gully like this tends to be fairly expensive to repair. It does impact your management, your trafficking across the field, and it does take, if you do end up fixing that with a grassed waterway, shaping it and seeding it to permanent vegetation, it generally takes maybe a couple acres out of production as well. So if we can work with you to prevent that from happening, that's kind of a win-win. And speaking of residue, we do see folks occasionally baling up residue off the fields, baling stocks, hauling it off. If that's something that you can avoid doing, it does leave a little more residue on the field to help protect it from those rain events. Now, I understand that, that's not always workable depending on your operation. Just this past fall, I was out with our operator, riding in the buddy seat with him, and he did have concern about the amount of residue on the surface for him to work with. So, and that's due to the fact that we're transitioning from a conventional system to something that's a little more soil health oriented, and we just have not built up the amount of bacteria and fungi below the surface to help break down that residue. All right, I wanted to talk just briefly about our cropping systems inventory. This is something that used to be mandatory for us to do up until about 2004. We did cease after that point, and we started back up again just voluntarily in 2013, and we complete this every 2 years. What it is we have our folks go out and drive transects after planting, just establish transects across every county, and just record what they're seeing, what type of tillage system is in place. And it gives us a snapshot. It's all aggregated on a county level basis, as you can see. And typically, the central part of the state where we've got row crops intersecting with a drier climate, tends to be our zone where we have the most acres in no-till. As you can see, the dark green is 75 to 100% of the acres no-till. All right, if we can advance that slide, there we go. Here's a little bit of the data that generated that map. As you can see over on the left-hand side, it's bar graphs of no-till. And if you go back to 2004, on the very left-hand side, roughly about 37% of the acres in the state were no-till at that time. And over a 15-year span, that has gotten to be upwards of 50%. So quite a change there, and if you look on the next set of bar graphs to the right, it appears that we picked up those acres in no-till by folks converting from other types of reduced tillage and mulch tillage into a full no-till. And you can see on the the far right-hand side, our acres of conventional tillage have stayed pretty much level. One challenge we had in 2019 was, if you look at the numbers at the top, they're kind of small, but we did have, given the weather, we did have a little challenge in collecting this data this year. Many acres were prevent plant. Some of our people couldn't actually get to the field sites because of washed out roads, things like that. So the numbers are down, but the percentages are reflective of what was observed. And as some of our prior presenters have already talked about, 2019 was a very wet year. 2018 was as well. We did offer some special programs to help producers plant cover crops those years to protect the soil, prevent weeds from growing, prevent the need to do a lot of tillage to keep the weeds down, that type of thing. So you can see here some of the extremes, anywhere from about 6 inches of over normal rainfall on the western side of the state up to about 13 inches above normal toward the eastern side of the state. So it was quite significant. And one thing our folks observed in doing this cropping systems survey in the field was that only about 20% of the no-till fields were prevent plant. So about 80% of them were able to be planted, which that's a little bit better percentage than some of the other types of tillage. Those were more in the upper 20s to upper 30s as far as the percent of acres that did not get planted. So a little bit of an interesting statistic there. Oops. There we go. I grabbed a few summary photos here of the acres of prevent plant by county. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. And the counties shaded in red and pink were the most severely impacted by the precipitation. So the counties that are shaded red had anywhere from 50 to 100,000 acres of prevent plant. And then on downward. So, and if you look to the left-hand side of the screen, that shows the cover crops acres in 2019. So it did kind of mirror the areas that were impacted and not able to be planted. So many of those acres did get planted to cover crops. All right, moving on from that, I wanted to talk just a little bit about financial assistance programs. This is a slide that just talks about on a national scale. Our agency does invest an average of $8 million every day to put into conservation systems to help producers. All right, and one of our key programs has been the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. It's still very popular, it continues to be popular. It's becoming more competitive. Back in 2017, we kind of hit a milestone and reached 7 million acres of land enrolled in CSP. So we led the nation that year and several years actually. And you can see this kind of the central region of South Dakota, or excuse me, central region of the country, shaded in greens and dark grays. Those had the largest amount of CSP obligated. As you get toward the West Coast and from Chicago and east, the program isn't utilized as heavily. All right, just a few more statistics here. A little bit of data. You can see this is the acres that we have contracted in EQIP and CSP by year. EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Programs, is our bread and butter program. It offers help with a lot of infrastructure for the most part, anything from pipelines, tanks, other structural practices to cover crops, permanent vegetation, shelter belts, whatnot. And CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, is more of an enhancement-based program. It takes you to the next level. So if you're already doing a good job, it offers some help with fine-tuning that. All right, this next slide shows our obligated program funding, again, for EQIP and CSP. We do have more dollars contracted in CSP. You'll notice kind of a drop-off over there in 2019 and 20. That's because of a change in CSP after the 2018 Farm Bill. We used to fund these, even though they're 5-year contracts, we funded them annually. And that was changed in 2018, affecting the years forward. So we're obligating those all 5 years up front. So that does make an impact there. Also, CSP has become a little more competitive nationwide. It was a program that was scrutinized in the 2018 Farm Bill, and we weren't sure for a while whether it was going to get renewed. So the other states across the country, the eastern states, western states, have been trying to utilize it a little more heavier. All right. Oops, let me back up one here. I skipped ahead. Thank you. One thing I wanted to mention that's new as of last year and going forward, we typically with our EQIP program, that's the bread and butter program that helps with infrastructure and some vegetative and management practices as well. We decided to make an effort to change that around a little bit from kind of a shotgun approach with helping producers anywhere and everywhere to focusing those efforts on a very particular area. Maybe a small watershed, maybe a few townships that had a identified concern or issue that they wanted to address. So we're on a 3-year cycle of transitioning our general EQIP funds into more of a focused approach like this. So this past year was our first year. We had 20 applications. We were able to approve 16 of those. You can see the little pinpoints on the map of where those are at. And there are a variety of different projects. Up at the top of the screen is a link to fact sheets for each of those projects, and then down at the bottom is a link to our fact sheet about this whole effort and the application information. So just for example, what some of those are up in Redfield area and the Webster area, we've got both of those projects address saline soils, saline and sodic soils. So the effort there is to really focus on those concerns and try to turn that around with various best management practices. Over in Clark County, that's a little unique. That is addressing soil health for honeybees, which is kind of interesting. We've heard a lot about honeybees the last few years, and the ups and downs of their survival and how that impacts the food web. So the effort there is to increase soil health and pollinator habitat to improve honeybees and other pollinators to pollinate our crops. So there's a variety of different things there, and that's, we're transitioning. We're through the first year, we're into the first year, and we'll take our second round of applications that are due April 15th. One of the things with these focused projects is to not only help the folks that are directly impacted, but try and make a point to the folks that may benefit from it. This slide is not from South Dakota. It talks about Lake Erie, but it makes the point of, you can see the little sign there. It talks about cover crops and says farmers protecting our lake. So it is important to educate folks on what our farmers and ranchers do to improve the quality not only on their own land, but offsite as well. All right, if we can get to the next slide. There we go. I also did want to mention a few things relative to some relatively new tools to help with decision-making processes. I believe most of you are probably familiar with the Every Acre Counts program, and we also have come up with an ag drainage decision tool that was done in-house with South Dakota NRCS. So just a few slides on that. We'll run through those here next. Every Acre Counts, that's a partnership effort. NRCS is involved, South Dakota Corn is involved, along with many other entities. And it's an effort to do an economic analysis on some marginal lands, lands that are affected by excess moisture, maybe susceptible to erosion, or areas that are impacted by salinity. And it's a chance to work with some experts to have them do an economic analysis on different options and choose what might be the best for you. One of the things, Anthony Bly is one of the key contacts, and that's on the next slide. He did mention that one of the things they're finding our folks are interested in CRP for some of these difficult areas, but they would really appreciate the opportunity to evaluate those areas prior to going into CRP, because they might be able to help provide enough information to adjust those boundaries to make it the most advantageous for each producer. So just something to think about there. A little bit on the ag drainage decision tool. It's an Excel-based tool that looks at production before and after drainage. It pulls in the data from our web soil survey, all the soils data, the drainage class information. There's some production data from Mitchell Technical Institute, average production data based on their annual survey of producers. There's also, it's been vetted with a number of different entities, as well as SDSU. The creator of this in South Dakota had worked with several producers as well, just to see, work through their scenarios and see if this would provide valuable information for them. So, and it gives you a chance to try and pencil out the pros and cons, see what kind of a return on investment you might have if you are considering doing some drainage. So there's a lot there. It's too much to get into today, but it is an option if that's something that you're interested in and looking at more of an economic analysis. Oops, went too far there. A few last things that I did want to mention. We do a lot of good work with a lot of producers. A lot of folks out there are doing excellent work, and there's a lot of people involved in the conservation effort. So, just wanted to mention some of the partners we're involved with, and some of the other avenues for reaching out to folks. Some of the partners we're involved with, obviously, South Dakota Corn is one, different ag groups, the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition, the Grasslands Coalition, Pheasants Forever, state, local, federal organizations, universities. We have a lot of good projects going on with many of these entities. I did want to mention something that you may or may not have heard about. It's an effort where we've partnered with the South Dakota Association of Conservation Districts to reach out to non-operator landowners. They're called NOLOws for short, but that's a group that not always gets, they don't always get the conservation message. And there's an effort being made to reach out to them. A survey was done about a year or so ago of these non-operating landowners, and it found that there's about 21,000 non-operating landowners in South Dakota that own about 17 million acres of land. And of that, of rented land, and of that, 70% is cropland. So they can have a huge impact on what happens out there. So this was an effort to reach out to them, provide them with some information, technical information, information on soil health, even information on how best to talk to their tenant. That, if depending on the situation, that may not be a natural thing. So just wanted to mention that is an ongoing effort, trying to reach out to those groups. They do have a website, if you're interested in checking that out. It's listed at the top. It's nolosd.org. They have some good resources on there. They've started making some videos, and a couple of those have been posted. So that's available, and you're sure welcome to take a look at that. Lastly, I wanted to mention the soil health voices and mentors in South Dakota. That's been an effort working with folks who are volunteering their time to provide information to other farmers and ranchers about soil health and just anything to do with agriculture. We've got a lot of very, very knowledgeable and experienced producers out there, and they have volunteered to talk to folks one-on-one, have folks maybe come to their farm, whatever they're comfortable with. Some do a lot of speaking in front of groups, and they are a very valuable resource. We do have a booklet that lists all of these soil health voices and mentors, and it details what kind of experience they have and what they're knowledgeable in. So they do provide a valuable resource to us in getting the word out about conservation and soil health. One last thing. We have a different little program that's more of an in-house program. It's called the Conservation Ag Mentorship Program, and that's more of an internal thing. we have, as we do our hiring, we typically look for folks, for young people that have backgrounds in agriculture. It just makes it so much easier to do our work if they had come to the job with that background. That's getting a little more difficult these days with less people on the farm. So for those that don't have that background, we try and pair them on a voluntary basis with producers that are willing to have folks spend time with them, our staff spend time with them. And we're just starting that this past year. We have just a handful of folks doing it, but I think it'll be a valuable thing, and hopefully it'll be a win-win situation. All right, well, that wraps up everything I had for you, and I believe we're going to tackle questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing with us about NRCS. Sounds like there's some great programs going on for young people as well as farmers looking to try some new environmental practices. Again, folks, as Michelle mentioned, questions are coming right up, so do make sure you get those sent in either via the chat box function in Zoom or text them to 605-951-0276. Next up, we have a great speaker who's going to talk a little bit more about the legal side of agricultural and environmental law. Alex Masteller is an attorney with Rinke Noonan Law Firm, and he and his firm concentrate their practice in the area of agricultural litigation, wetland and drainage law, important issues that are impacting agriculture, and more. So let's turn our attention over to Alex.
Wait for my presentation to come up. My name is Alex Masteller. I'm an attorney at Rinke Noonan Law Firm. We're located in St. Cloud, Minnesota, but I spend a substantial amount of my time in the eastern third of South Dakota, North Dakota, and then western Minnesota doing agricultural issues with a very heavy emphasis on water issues. We have 6 attorneys that focus on this primarily, and they're licensed anywhere from Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and of course South Dakota. So let's see if I can get this to. Okay, so I'll start by doing a little bit of an overview on where the sources of water and drainage law come from. There's a lot of different things to know, and hence why you would maybe need an attorney, and hopefully you don't need an attorney, but many people do. There's a lot of different things to know from an agricultural producer standpoint that is, it's almost unreasonable for you to have to know. There's what's called common law, that's created by courts, just sort of how things have occurred over the years and court cases have been decided. There's the codified law, which is federal laws, regulations, state statutes, and then even local and zoning ordinances. And then there's contract law, which is a contract between individuals. In this case, it'd be easements or landlord-tenant agreements, stuff of that nature. Any one of these slides that I'm about to go through, I could probably do an hour on. And so I'm going to go fast. I'm sure there'll be questions. If there are questions that we can't even answer today, just give me a call. I love talking about this stuff. It is a substantial part of what I do. So the first thing to discuss will be, there's a difference between the eastern part of the United States and the western part of the United States on their approaches to water law. And frankly, there's no more specific example of this than in South Dakota. The eastern half of the state, East River, is generally more wet than West River. And so drainage and drainage infrastructure is less common West River, and it's quite common East River, and it's even increasing in popularity based on the last few years being wet. The east part of the United States in eastern South Dakota, there's just too much water. The water's a common enemy for everyone, and trying to get it away from surfaces as best you can. In the western part of South Dakota in the United States, there's maybe too little water, and people have appropriation permit issues and want water. And so it's a really big difference. One of the other sources of federal regulation from water is the Clean Water Act. This is where the Corps of Engineers gets their power to govern the waters of the United States. And so that is applicable in many areas when you're dealing with an actual water body, lake, or a named stream, and even unnamed streams. Sometimes the Corps of Engineers has regulation over. And so there's another source of consternation, or if you have to get a permit, you have to go through them if you want to impact or alter the water of the United States in any way. Another source of federal law is the Swamp Buster 1985 Food Security Act. This is regulated by the USDA, NRCS, and the FSA. We just had the NRCS individual speak. There's a lot of regulation when it comes to protecting wetlands and highly erodible lands. And so if you're ineligible to receive farm program benefits if you convert wetlands or highly erodible lands into crop production after December 23rd, 1985. That's been over 30 years ago, but these issues are still very, very relevant today. There's a definition of wetland that is unique to the Swamp Buster regulations, and that's a three-part test. It's hydric soils, hydrology, meaning inundation or saturation, and then the prevalence of hydrophytic vegetation. So you have to have all three of those things to meet wetland criteria. And then the definition of prior converted is you convert one of these areas prior to this date, this December 23rd, 1985 date. If you have cropped that or converted the wetland prior to that, you are exempt essentially from this. That wetland area is exempt from the regulation. Before Swamp Buster, on a federal level, there wasn't a ton of regulation. I mean, this slide here shows just a snippet of what we've pulled from the Department of Agriculture in the past, just discussing the benefits of tile. And these, of course, everything has become modernized, and tile has become somewhat, I guess some people think it's controversial, but it's very, very common, and it's being even more common, and it's almost seen in some areas as a necessary component of agricultural improvement. The Swamp Buster regulation, this is just an example of sort of what the maps look like when you, in order to prevent yourself from getting into trouble with the violation of Swamp Buster, many properties have had certified wetland determinations performed on them. This is just an example of what a certified wetland determination map looks like, showing the different acre sizes of the wetlands and the boundaries. So regarding the South Dakota specific law for wetland regulation, there's a few different sources. There's the civil law rule, which applies to rural drainage, which is a substantial amount of my practice dealing with the civil law rule. And that essentially states that a downstream landowner is burdened with an easement under which the upstream landowner may discharge water over that property. That doesn't give an unfettered right to just open up the faucet and drain, but it is in the statutes and in case law that water gets to drain where it otherwise would naturally go. You can't put berms up on your fence lines. The lower landowner has the burden from the upper landowner to drain. There's also urban drainage, which is a little less relevant, but it somewhat relevant in that the reasonable use rule applies, which is really sort of a fact-intensive analysis of what's reasonable. If the flow of the surface water is altered and it causes some harm to an adjacent landowner, what's the harm, and is it reasonable? Is it the fact that there's just more water? Is that reasonable, or is the use in the drainage structure actually reasonable? So a landowner can be liable if your drainage infrastructure is unreasonable, or if you damage a neighbor. There's also the statutes, 46A, 10A is the chapter on which South Dakota drainage regulation is contained, and it identifies the specific rights and responsibilities of everyone. There's also, that statute also creates the ability for counties to regulate drainage through a drainage board or permitting process, which I'll get into. There's also vested drainage rights. And so this was a statute that was enacted, and any natural drainage rights that were lawfully acquired prior to July 1st of 1985 became vested. And that process was, you'd go down to the courthouse at the county recorder's office, you would mark up your drains that were in place at that time, and they were essentially recorded against your property and against the property of the people that had drainage infrastructure on them. So if you had a ditch on your land and it extended into your neighbor's property, this was a process to essentially record that information so that there would be no questions into the future if there was any manipulation, or if you expanded or didn't have that right. So it was for drainage that was entirely man-made or with man-made modifications. And this issue comes up as well because there often are people forget about this stuff, and all of a sudden somebody starts cleaning out a ditch and somebody doesn't think they should be able to do it. Well, sometimes individuals took the time to go get and record this ditch or have a vested drainage right, and it puts them in a much better position when they want to do maintenance or improvements to certain infrastructure. There's also the public drainage code, which I mentioned before. This is what gives counties the right to regulate drainage. They may pass ordinances or other legal controls that pertain to drainage management or drainage projects. And the statute identifies essentially 6 things that the drainage must have in order to be legal. And it's 6 things that the counties must consider when considering a drainage project. County drainage ordinances are becoming much, they're becoming much under fire because they are very difficult in application, and they're very difficult to apply to every situation. There's many counties recently, and I've been in front of many county drainage boards that have considered completely repealing their drainage ordinance because it's just causing too much trouble. What happens in the end is somebody comes in and applies for a permit, and a neighbor or somebody else doesn't like it, and a county then has to sit and sort of be the judge, jury, and executioner on whether that person gets the permit or not. And what it ends up doing is it opens the county up to legal battles where they make a decision the best they can, and it may not be the decision that any of the parties want, and one of the parties then sues them. And then the county is stuck sort of in the middle defending the drainage permit process, and they don't have any real benefit to it because they're not the landowner on either side of the fence. And so we've seen recently many counties moving away from this because it's just too much of a burden in application. There are many counties that still have drainage ordinances, but it seems to me that the trend is moving away from it and saying, you know, the state law gives the landowners and producers what it gives them. We don't have to get in the middle of this. There's also county drainage projects. And this is something that is increasing in popularity as well. Back in the early 1900s, before 1920, there was many counties that undertook drainage projects, a large public ditch or something along those lines, where a bunch of people in the area would benefit from it and be able to, get tile into or ditch into, and then it moves through properties and to a adequate outlet. The statutes are still in place. What happened was in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s, there was a big dry period. I mean, we're on the northern end of the Dust Bowl here, and these things kind of fell out of people's minds because drainage wasn't as important when you're dry. Over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, though, it's been some of the wettest times in history here, and these public drainage projects are coming back online because you see the need for it. And there's a lot of places there's an old ditch, nobody really knows who's responsible for it. Well, most of the time it was the county that constructed that ditch, and they can take and assess the people that are benefited to maintain it. And it's a great way for coordinated drainage, because you can only do so much if you own the four corners of your property. You can only do so much. Maybe you don't have an adequate outlet. This is a great process that allows everybody to benefit, and it allows everybody to pay for it in a reasonable way, where their acres are assessed based on the percentage of the project and the benefit that they receive. There are also the ability for individuals and groups to create watershed districts and water project districts. These are another sort of regional or local control aspect, much like the county public drainage, that it sort of fell out of favor because of the dry times. Now that times are wet, there's much more concerted effort being put towards how do we get this water to work for us on a local level. Everybody has problems. What are we going to do? So these two entities that the statutes allow people to form these entities provide for local management of these water resources on a watershed or drainage basin boundary instead of political boundaries in the case of watershed districts. So you take the entire area of a drainage basin, and that becomes a watershed district, and it's not drawn on county lines or township lines or anything like that. It's drawn based on essentially science in the elevations and contour of the land. And then you can have local control on water management within that drainage basin. And these drainage basins can be very, very large, or they can be very small. I mean, down to a few thousand acres, or they can be upwards in the neighborhood of 50, 60,000 acres, or even more. And so the construction of drainage and flood control projects would then be funded by the land in that basin. It allows people to act more quick when it comes to problems. You don't have to run it up the flagpole or get a lot of other politics involved. You can control it on a local basis. And one of the things that's, this primarily, I have been involved in drainage, but increasingly I'm getting involved in flood protection and flood control. And these watershed districts and water project districts are able to do either drainage or flood control. It's really management of water either one way or another. Flood control has been extremely, extremely important in the lower Big Sioux area, the lower part of the Vermilion River watershed area. There's just simply a lot of flooding happening in the last few years, and hopefully it gets better, but that doesn't change the need for a prospective system that allows people to have local control. And water project districts, very similar to watershed districts. I'm actually not even certain how much different they are, other than there's no requirement in a water project district for a contiguous land or watershed boundary. So you don't have to get everybody or assess everyone in a certain area. People can pick and choose who's involved. Yeah, the drainage projects and flood control projects, as I mentioned, historically it's focused on improving drainage. There's drainage ditches, public drainage tile. Like I mentioned in years, flood protection and prevention has become extremely important. The maintenance of levees and other diversion infrastructure is really left to the people that own the property on which those levees or diversions exist. And if one levee goes, of course, you're only as good as the weakest link, and it's been the responsibility of local landowners to maintain these things over years, and that cost has been quite substantial. And there are, like the NRCS presenter mentioned, there's a lot of non-operator landowners, and so a non-operator landowner is going to be less likely to invest a bunch of money and effort into maintaining levees when they aren't the person reaping the benefits necessarily. And so getting a coordinated system in place has become much more important and much more pressing in recent years. Another issue that has come up in the last few years and it's hot in the area that it affects is the non-meandered waters. In the northeastern part of the state, Day County, Clark County, there's large bodies of water that have increased in size that were never the size they are today, and they actually encompass many acres of property that were formerly produced tillable crops. And so there was some controversy as to the use of those non-meandered waters by the public. That caused a lot of consternation with the people still paying taxes for the land that's underneath the lake now. And so there was 27 bodies of water that were reopened or essentially opened to public, recreation, fishing, hunting, that kind of thing. And the default rule was that the non-meandered waters were open to recreation unless posted and marked by the landowner. And so landowners have been pushing this issue to move forward on what's going to happen, and it's been the subject of even litigation. There's been many townships that are essentially vacating roads that would allow people to access these waters because they just don't want people hunting, fishing, doing whatever over the private property of another. So it's kind of a sticky issue. So here's some examples of some drainage case law that is out there. A couple of these are examples of county board permit decisions that ended up getting litigated. And so this first case is this Carmody versus Lake County Board of Commissioners. Again, neighbors fighting over the issuance of a drainage permit, and the county drainage board had decided to grant the permit, and it got appealed to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, this case resulted in Lake County repealing their drainage ordinance because they experienced the difficulty and pains of litigation and going through a long process for something that they didn't believe was necessary. And so this is one of those cases that sort of triggered the repealing of a drainage ordinance. And I'm not going to go through every one of them, but there's another, the matter of drainage permit 1181, Minnehaha County drainage permit case. This case, I believe, resulted in Minnehaha County repealing their drainage permit. Even prior to the issuance of this decision, they decided they didn't want to be in the drainage permit business, and so they repealed their ordinance. That's quite common now. There's some of the older case law is sort of establishes everything that we know now today, that you can drain in ordinary course through natural water courses or established water courses. There's unique systems everywhere. It has been held that drain tile is allowed. I mean, that was litigated early into the 80s. People didn't believe drain tile was natural or established. It's essentially been allowed because you're not increasing the volume of water, you're just moving the water the way it would normally go using gravity. There's also some contractual elements of water and drainage law. One of the most common ones that I see is a drainage easement. It gives somebody the right to drain onto, through, or across the property of another. These were less common because of just handshake agreements, and nowadays, and I tell everybody because I'm an attorney that sees the worst case scenarios, unfortunately, let's get it in writing and put it and record it against the property so there are no questions whether, where and whether this drainage is allowed. And so when you have a drain tile system and you need to go through the property of your neighbor, it's very simple to just draft up an easement, get everybody to sign it, record it, and then it is perpetual. And then your system and your outlet is protected forever, until it's revoked by both parties or it lasts in perpetuity. Another area that's come up in the news recently in the region is the wetland and waterfowl production area easements. These were given out in the 60s and 70s by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect certain potholes and wetland areas. And so you keep owning the land. They paid you a sum back in the 60s or 70s, and then you can't convert that wetland area or do anything to impact the wetland nature of it forever. And so now that people kind of have seen what you can do with tile and what you can do with certain things, there's been some consternation as to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service applying this and what rights do people have. And logically, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, in the easements, there are criminal penalties for violating the easement. So it's not just a civil penalty, a fine of some sort. It's a criminal penalty, and my firm has defended several producers regarding that have been criminally charged for violating easements, either by accident or whether or not they knew there was an easement or not. It's a source of a lot of consternation. Yeah, here's an example of those production area easements and sort of the regions on which they focused. It's much of North Dakota and the eastern third or eastern half of South Dakota, along with southern Minnesota. Actually, last year, the Secretary of the Interior came out with a directive that said all these easement areas need to be mapped, and the maps need to be provided if they hadn't done so in the recent past. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, starting in April or March of 2020, started sending out maps to people that allowed for appeal rights if they didn't agree with the areas mapped by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that process has been underway, where there's many areas that people didn't think had easements that the Fish and Wildlife Service is saying have easements. And again, it's become a subject of dispute because the original easement language, when it was entered into with many of these people's grandparents or even great-grandparents back in the 60s, didn't have maps. It just said an acreage amount. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has interpreted what those acreage amounts look like to them, and the agricultural producers had interpreted it in a different way. The Fish and Wildlife Service has tended to focus on much smaller areas that don't always even appear to be wetland areas on any given year. While producers say, well, yeah, we understand we got a big swamp over here. We never thought it was these very small dots across our field. So that appeal process is underway, and the outcome is unknown. Yeah, so that is a very brief drainage overview. Again, I have every slide could be its own presentation. So if there are any questions, we'll try to answer them now. Otherwise, you can give me a call.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. We are going to have our final panelist join us, this time via Zoom, so bear with us if we do have any technical issues here. But our third and final panelist is Laura Moody, who is the Vice President of Stewardship and Sustainability with the Fertilizer Institute. She leads the development and implementation of the Institute's programs to increase the use and adoption of fertilizer best management practices. She also oversees sustainability initiatives related to fertilizer production and its use in the field. Laura, do we have you with us now?
I think we do. I think we're good to go.
Fantastic. Laura, I will let you take it away.
Great. And I am going to work on the assumption that you all are going to show my slides and that you can see my slides right now. If somebody could just acknowledge that.
Yes, they look great. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. So let me just do a quick introduction. So first, thanks, South Dakota corn growers, for inviting me to speak with you. I hope next year, perhaps, I will be back on the road. I myself usually travel a couple of times a month, and I've been missing that lately. So I hope that we're getting back to normal later this year. But the Fertilizer Institute is the voice of the U.S. fertilizer industry. We represent the policy, stewardship needs of fertilizer producers, wholesalers, and retailers, as well as the businesses that support them. And from our kind of mission perspective, we're committed to the safe, secure, and sustainable production and distribution and use of plant nutrition. And so with that, what I want to take some time to talk about today are some of the issues that we have facing nutrient loss, give you some insights into some of the things that we're seeing, show you some of the tools we have that may help you reduce your nutrient loss further, which translates into improved economics on the farm with reduced fertilizer use potentially, as well as talk about some of the drivers behind the push, the kind of continued push that we have for improved water quality and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And those aren't purely linked to regulation these days. And so I'll touch on a few of those things as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And so if you could go to the next slide. I want to cover, like I said, nutrient balance. I want to talk a little bit about what nutrient balance is and how we assess that, what nutrient loss pathways we're talking about. If you haven't heard of them yet, I'll talk a little bit about 4R nutrient stewardship and give you some exposure into what the economic and environmental benefits are of that space. And again, talk about what's driving or what's likely to drive increased adoption. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The Fertilizer Institute has available, and anybody, I've added the website here, it's NUGIS it's NUGIS, NUGIS.tfi.org. I read that out because I see it's slightly covered by the South Dakota corn logo. That's a bit of a database that we have available. A lot of academics use it, some federal and state agencies use it, but we actually use it within our industry. Both our members and TFI use it to have a better idea of where nutrients are being used and what kind of excesses or deficiencies look like. And so what I did is I went into the database and I zeroed in on South Dakota. That is my kind of pen drawing around the state of South Dakota, because really it just shows up as counties on the map that I look at. And it's an indication of nutrient balance. And so specifically what it's showing is inputs, so nutrient inputs minus nutrient outputs. And the inputs being what you maybe apply as fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, or manure, or some of the biological fixation that happens with nitrogen in particular. And then the outputs basically are any nutrient that was removed with the yield that came off. And so if you have a negative balance, that means that you're removing more than you're putting on. And that means that you're kind of in that red, you see those red and orange colors that are on there. On the other hand, if you are putting more on than you're removing, right, you have a positive balance. And so that's where the green colors show up. So if you think of like two concentric circles and where they like maybe meet in the middle, it's that sweet spot in the middle that we're trying to achieve. From an environmental standpoint, you know, anything that's negative to that sweet spot is good, because that means that our potential for loss is down, right? Because we're removing more nutrients from the corn system than we're actually putting in. But from a farmer's agronomic and economic perspective, when you get into that negative, when you get into those red and orange areas that you see on there, that means that you're actually removing more nutrients than what you're putting on. And so we tend to see this in many locations across the country, but essentially what you see there in those three maps is the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium balance. And generally what you're seeing there is for potassium in particular, you're seeing potassium levels are slightly negative, which means as a whole, you're removing more in general from the state than you are applying. Relative to phosphorus, some counties are in the sweet spot of that yellow range where the balance is equal. Some counties not, a little negative. And then when you look at the nitrogen, that's when you see, you know, there are a few areas, and maybe you all know your areas of the state and some of the watershed you have there, or maybe where maybe you have some water issues, but you see the green areas that are slightly positive, which means you're applying more than you're taking off, and then the yellow areas that are in balance. So I just put that out there as a starting place for when we start thinking about nutrient loss and how we kind of make that economic and environmental segue meet. So let's go on to the next slide. And I wanted to just talk briefly. I never know kind of what folks know in the audience relative to nutrient loss. So I put a little graphic in here. And when I'm talking about nutrient loss, generally we're focused on nitrogen and phosphorus because those two have an environmental impact. And so nitrogen pathways, we can lose nitrogen multiple different ways. We can lose nitrogen as ammonia volatilization. That means it comes off as a gas, usually when you apply urea. If it's not incorporated soon enough or doesn't have enough moisture, you know, a dry air, heat will allow your ammonia to come off your urea. Another above ground loss pathway is just through runoff, right? So if you have nitrogen or phosphorus that's in the soil and you get a soil particle that's moving, or maybe you've broadcast your phosphorus on and you get a rain event and it moves right just with water flow. The ones that you can't see, right, are the nitrate and phosphate leaching that can take place. Phosphate leaching is much less likely to occur. You have to have pretty high phosphate levels to get phosphate leaching to occur. But nitrate leaching does occur. So you apply either urea or ammonium nitrate or anhydrous ammonia, and it goes down into the soil as the form of ammonia. And because of the ion that's tied to it, it doesn't move with water. But once ammonia converts to nitrate in the microbial processes, then it can move with water. And so that's when you can see nitrate leaching. The other thing that it can occur in certain conditions in the soil, when you have wetter conditions, a certain class of bacteria, or the microbes that are present that are a part of your kind of mineralization and immobilization of your nitrogen that's in your soil, you can also get nitrous oxide emissions. And that's when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And so all of those loss pathways are important to you as a farmer because, you know, you've got your stakeholders that are paying attention to it relative to the environmental loss and the nitrogen or phosphorus that's moving into the environment. But from a farmer's perspective, it's the economics you care about. You want to make sure that those nutrients are staying in the soil, in the root zone where they can be taken up by the plant. Several years ago, back in 2006, USDA did a pretty significant modeling effort across the US. And in that assessment, they were looking at what the potential for loss was. Within the nitrogen space, within the Northern Great Plains for corn, they estimated that if practices weren't put in place, your potential nitrogen loss was 51 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That's a pretty significant number. And for phosphorus, it was more like 3 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year. And, you know, you think, well, from an environmental perspective, 3 pounds, that's not very much. But I'll tell you that in the Western Lake Erie Basin, you've likely heard of algal blooms and the challenges that Ohio has relative to the Western Lake Erie Basin, they're having to reduce their environmental loss by 1 pound of phosphorus per acre. And so a little bit does matter when you're talking about phosphorus. So what do we do about these things to reduce those nutrient losses? So let's go on to the next slide. So I'd love it if I could see all of your faces and ask you to raise your hands and let me know if anybody has kind of seen or heard about 4R nutrient stewardship before. But about a decade ago, I was actually at Iowa State University for 6 years doing research and extension out of the Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department. And about 10 years ago, the Fertilizer Institute asked me to join them and build out an extension and outreach program for the industry in the nutrient stewardship space. And so I came along, I switched to DC, moved to Washington, DC, and have been there for the last 10 years working on gathering research needs, outreach needs, gathering stakeholders, working to ensure that fertilizer best management practices are integrated into different models and pathways within federal agencies and et cetera. Because our goal here is really not to just address environmental concerns by a rate-based decision only. And so that's not good for, it's not good for the outcome, the long-term outcome, it's not good for the farmer. So before our nutrient stewardship, we're really talking about utilizing fertilizer best management practices that help us address the right source of nutrient, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And that's really best seen by an example. So actually, I put several examples together, and let's just walk through some of those. First one, this is an older example, but when I was assembling my slide set for Heather, as she knows, she didn't get them until 11 o'clock last night, I pulled one that I had already sitting in an old presentation. And so this one is actually from a farmer in Illinois, 3,800 acre corn and soybean farmer. The data that I'm going to share with you is from kind of 2006 to 2013. And essentially, this farmer, you can see in the data points that I've got there that from 2006 to 2012, his average yields were about 193 bushels per acre. And then, oh, thanks for switching the slide. I forgot to tell you, I switched it on my own. In 2013, his average corn yield was 234 bushels per acre. And that's really when he started integrating a bunch of additional practices. One of the points a term I'm gonna use here, so we talked about nutrient balance. The other term we tend to think about is nitrogen use efficiency, and we shorten that as NUE. And when we're thinking about nitrogen use efficiency, it can be calculated a couple of different ways, but the way I'm going to reference it here, nitrogen use efficiency is basically the pounds of nitrogen applied as a ratio or related to the yield, the bushels that were removed, right? So the lower that number comes, the more efficient you're getting with your nitrogen use. And so essentially what you see is that farmer changed his practices from 2012 to 2013, you see him increase his nitrogen use efficiency, which also resulted in some increased yields. And yes, I know we can't quite tie all of that to those practices. It could have something to do with the particular weather year that we had. But I think really importantly, what we see is that improvement in nitrogen use efficiency. The types of practices that he was implementing is on his farm in that 2013 year. You can see the different sources of product that he was using. You know, phosphorus, potassium, some ammonia with a nitrification inhibitor, NSER. Some of his nitrogen, phosphorus, and his starter went down with zinc. And he also used an in-season UAN solution with another inhibitor product in it. Relative to rate, he was making his decisions based on grid samples and also assessing his recommendations with harvested removal rates and yield. He was applying his phosphorus and potassium in the fall right after harvest. He was waiting to apply his fall nitrogen. That's a common practice in Illinois after the 50-degree soil temperature so that we reduce microbial changes in the product that we apply. And then he was using a late spraying side dress for his nitrogen. And then finally, he is variable rating his P&K, and then he is also strip till banding some of his ammonium in season. So that's just one specific example. But since that time, since that 2013 time set where this data came from, one of the things that we heard from growers as we were engaging them is they really wanted to know, it's great to know what the practices are, but what's it going to cost us to change? And what are the real things that we see from change? And if we just have one example, that's not sufficient. We actually want to see a lot of examples. So we undertook in the last few years work with the University of Kentucky, ag economists, a couple of guys from down there. And we built out a model that we could use to build case studies around 4R. And so since then, that's what we've been doing. We've been expanding our set of case studies. And our case studies look at basically all the costs and changes that take place to implement a set of fertilizer best management practices. And we're looking at not only the fertilizer use itself, but the labor changes that go with changing pieces of equipment or changing management decisions. We look at the energy use, and we also look at the fuel use and then the cost of the equipment. And so all of that's built into our model that we utilize to develop these case studies. And so what I just wanted to show you is, I showed you just one example from Illinois. We actually don't have a South Dakota. And if you go to the next slide, we actually don't have a South Dakota case study, although it's something that probably we should talk with the corn growers there and see if they want to partner with us to develop some. But I pulled one from Minnesota. And so essentially what you see relative to this farmer, here's a list of some of the practices that he's got in place. So he's switched over from whole field soil sampling to a management zone where he's sampling within those management zones to better make his decisions. He is utilizing field mapping and crop removal data, as well as the Iowa State University nitrogen calculator to determine his nutrient needs. He's doing now all nitrogen is split applied with an inhibitor in the spring, and there's no fall application anymore on his farm. He's doing a 2x2 band with his phosphorus and placing it below the soil to reduce his loss, using some micronutrients in the spring, and he's incorporating those in so that they're not sitting on the top of the soil. Just some other conservation practice he's doing. He's got strip till. He's also been able to build some of his organic matter. He in particular uses a strip till machine, the Soil Warrior that he's able that he does for his tillage to be able to place nutrients when he's doing that tillage system. All right. So what has that garnered him? So one of the things that we can do is just look at the changes in the cost of 4R practice adoption. Thanks for going to the next slide again. I keep forgetting to tell you that. We know that weather has implications for the cost of practices because we're looking at the cost of practices and different things may impact what the final decisions are that year. So we try and look across a multi-year period. And in this case, we were looking at 2014 through 2017. And what you see is as the points on that screen, the 2014 and 2015, the first 2 points, we called those his basic 4R practices. And then in 2016, go ahead and go back one slide. And then in 2016, you see that he's moved to some intermediate practices, and then 2017 is his advanced practices. So what you see on this screen basically is the change in cost. We consider that one an outlier, probably linked to the weather or other things that were happening on the farm that year. But essentially, those are the practice changes. And let's take a little bit deeper dive. So go one more slide. So as the farmer has changed his practices, I think some really important things that we see that are driving that. Number one, his nitrogen application rate has changed as he's dialed in his practices. And so you see his application rate from go above 200 down to 195, down to 184, and his yields are not being harmed by that. We also see his nitrogen use efficiency and his nitrogen balance start to change. So remember, nitrogen use efficiency is pounds applied per bushel of grain removed, and you see that go from 1.15 down to 0.89. Similarly, remember back to the initial slides, we were talking about nitrogen balance, where we're looking for basically to understand nitrogen applied minus the harvested nitrogen. And again, that number is continually going down, which is positive for the farmer and the environment. And then the other thing that we've started looking at is we actually have the ability to calculate nitrous oxide emissions, and we convert that to carbon dioxide equivalents. And so he's been able to achieve about a 20%. There you see a 19% reduction in his carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions as he's made those practice changes. So let's go. I've got two more quick examples. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, just a summary, but let's go on to the next slide. And so I pulled another case study that we had, and this is a case study from Wisconsin, a corn grain system. And so again, what we see is his cost of production has gone down as he's increased his implementation and his management of his fertilizer, moving from intermediate to advanced sets of practices. We see his nitrogen application rate go down from above 200 down to 176. We also see improvements in his nitrogen use efficiency and his nitrogen balance. This farmer was also making changes in his phosphorus application rate as well. In particular, this was a manured system, and so oftentimes in manured systems, we see higher nutrient use. So as he started to dial that in, those were improving. And again, we see an 18% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that's positive to show that we not only receive an environmental benefit here, but we get an economic benefit and how closely those two things are linked together. And so let's go one more slide for just one more example. When we look at no-till corn in Ohio, so here's another case study that we did. And again, similar things. You see the farmer move from basic to advanced sets of 4R practices. You see his nitrogen application rate go from above 200 down to 184 pounds per acre. Again, similarly, you see improvements in his nitrogen use efficiency and nitrogen balance, and he has a 19% reduction in his greenhouse gas emissions. So those are just some examples of that we've assembled. If you want to go, if you want to find some more information on case studies or dive into some of the practices that you're doing, what maybe potential changes you can see on your farm, let's go to the next slide. I would point you towards a website that we have set up. So it's 4rfarming.org. And on that website, we have a growing number of practices. You all may not care about the tomato farms in Florida or cotton in Texas, but we've got a pretty broad set of practices there. We have some new Wisconsin ones coming in. We have a few from Washington State coming in, and then we've got some random ones across the country we'll be working on this year. So that's a continually evolving place where we'll continue to post case studies. Now, I happen to show you 3 where all of them saw a positive economic return and benefit. That's not always the case. Sometimes we see it a little close, but generally, anytime we move from basic to intermediate to advanced, we see improvements in nutrient use efficiency and improvements in yield. So let's go one more slide. One other thing you can do on that 4rfarming.org website is there's a quiz. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it says be a 4R farmer, and you can learn more. And it walks you through a series of questions. And basically it's asking you questions about, kind of what practices you implement on your farm. And at the end, it'll kind of give you the 4R level that you are on your farm. But I think more importantly, it will make some suggestions for things you might consider talking to your crop advisor or retailer about. So maybe there are things that you want to consider implementing on your farm. Let's go another slide. I promised I'd wrap out the end with some thoughts on what's driving increased practice adoption. And so I just want to say a few things about what we're seeing at the national level, or what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. play out across the ag landscape. So relative to water quality, crop production is really in the non-point space. Unless you're in very specific watersheds like Western Lake Erie Basin or Chesapeake Bay, you don't see very specific rules that are being applied to cropping systems. However, we always feel that pressure. There are TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, that are being implemented to address impaired waters. Sometimes that brings specific practices onto farmers in specific watersheds. We also see non-point source funding that comes from EPA and other agencies within the state to be able to work on voluntary practice adoption. I would say the biggest thing we're seeing right now is investor activism. You've probably heard that talked about in other terms. You might have heard people say, basically food supply chain sustainability, but it's getting even more, I would say, it's not more charged, but it's increasing in its frequency and its intensity. And so in the investor activism place, basically you're seeing boards of publicly traded companies put pressure on those companies to do more in this space. We have fertilizer industry members who are now looking for zero carbon or net zero by 2050. We see them taking a deeper dive into their engagement in carbon markets, looking at how they change their production practices, piloting what they call green ammonia plants that may be powered by different sources than just the traditional natural gas, which we use for nitrogen production. We see food companies like Cargill or General Mills making pretty significant commitments in the regenerative ag space. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. When you look at their definitions of regenerative ag relative to fertilizer, basically they're talking about 4R implementation. And then we're just seeing broader corporate commitments like from Walmart as we've had in the past and otherwise. So investor activism is definitely driving us. I mean, one thing that we're paying attention to just came up last week. The World Benchmarking Alliance has identified 350 agriculture companies that they're going to be benchmarking relative to their commitments for the environment. We don't know the extent to which those are going to have an impact on those companies, but we have seen their draft metrics for benchmarking. And one of their metrics is around, moving companies working to move from inorganic to organic fertilizer sources and in their supply chains. And I think, that's challenging. We don't think that's going to have a big impact on those companies, but it's something that we're paying attention to. And we definitely see investor activism as one of the challenge areas. I think climate change mitigation, we know with the new administration, they've already made the commitment to get back into the COP. So we actually see that as an opportunity to have more funding and more focus on increasing nutrient management, increasing nutrient management practices. And so before we left the COP a few years ago, USDA had been working with us on a set of nitrogen building blocks where they were actively supporting increased nutrient management through their incentive programs. And I think we'll see that come back around as the new administration comes in, as well as the potential establishment of carbon markets. You see the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium working in that space. You guys have probably read about NORI and Indigo Ag. Most recently, we see a transition document from the new administration that talks about the potential to set up a carbon bank within USDA. So I think there's going to be work happening in that space, and there's opportunities for farmers that are interested in implementing these best management practices. Let's go one more slide. I think the other thing that's driving change and will continue to drive change is innovation. And so I just wanted to highlight one thing to kind of be on the lookout for in the next year, particularly since TFI partnered with the national corn growers on this effort, as well as many others. But EPA and USDA created and led an effort for something we're calling the Next Gen Fertilizer Challenges. And so they had two challenge areas. One of those was environmental and agronomic outcomes related to enhanced efficiency fertilizers. So we're talking about slow and controlled release fertilizers and polymer coated fertilizers and urease and nitrification inhibitors. So we had a challenge around those. And then we had a second challenge around additional amendments that hadn't come out on the market yet, just to understand what kind of ideas were being generated. And we especially opened the door to the biostimulant space. And so what you'll see in the coming year are results of those challenges coming out, in particular the first challenge, and I think this is something particularly to pay attention to. The first challenge is going to result in 10 to 15 of those enhanced efficiency products being tested in a common laboratory with common practices, where you'll be able to kind of compare apples to apples to apples, all of those products and outcomes from those products, both from an environmental and yield potential. So I think that's really cool to see that coming down the line. And then the other challenge, those results will come out later, and it's just going to give us some insights in the types of innovations that are coming down the line relative to fertilizer. So we can just close out for the last slide. I had one final thought to leave you with. I actually had to speak last week on a consultation that the U.S. is doing relative to the UN Food Systems Summit. And so the UN Food Systems Summit is going to be taking place in the fall of this year. And the U.S. has hosted the first dialogue to take input in preparation for what they'll frame up as their part of the report to the UN Food Systems Summit. And we're getting a lot of pressure. Well, I wouldn't say us in particular. The industry's feeling some pressure. The U.S. is seeing pressure because the EU in particular, the European Union, you might have heard of their Green Deal or their Farm to Fork effort, which is really about reducing inputs and removing a lot of the technologies like GMO and other crop inputs, pesticides and herbicides that we use in production agriculture. So there's a collection of us, working DC trade associations that are working to ensure that production agriculture is a part of those dialogues and of the summit. But I pulled together some data, and I just thought you guys might find it interesting, especially as I'm trying to sell you on, kind of further implementation of 4R nutrient stewardship to address some of your challenges. And so I looked at nutrient use efficiency and corn yield at 4 different scales. So I pulled those numbers for the world, Central EU, US, and an average across our 4R advocates. That's a series of 50 farmers that we have worked with over the last 10 years. And so here, let me just, again, it's really important to define the numbers. So here, nutrient use efficiency in this ratio is basically nutrient removal to input. So the closer you are to 1, the more balanced your removal to input is. And actually, when you go over 1, you're actually starting to mine nutrients. So when you go beyond 1, you're actually starting to remove more nutrients than you're putting into the system. And you say, well, how can you do that? Well, in nitrogen, we've got this nitrogen sink that's kind of a bit in organic soils or that's immobilized. And so that's how we kind of pull that nitrogen. Anyways, what you see here, I think really astoundingly, is that within the EU, they have the lowest nitrogen use efficiency of those that I've showed here, even lower than the world average. You see our number for our 4R advocates actually double that. And it's actually 50% greater than the US average. So I think to me, what that tells me is 1, our 4R advocates happen to be folks that are pretty progressive, but 2, the decisions that they're making on the farm is having an impact on their economies and their production. And we see the same benefits out of yield. So anyways, that's my final thought and consideration for thinking about what your fertilizer best management practices are. And so with that, we can just go to the next slide and I'll wrap up, and I look forward to questions with the panel.
Fantastic. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to open it up for questions, as you mentioned there. One other little housekeeping item for folks. Heather just shared in the Zoom chat function the link to the virtual silent auction. This year, things are obviously looking a little different with folks being at home. You can still participate in that auction virtually, and the link is shared in the Zoom chat function, and that will be open until 9 p.m. tonight. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. And folks, again, you can text in your questions to 650-951-0276 or throw those in the chat box there. I'm trying to monitor those as we're going through them here. But Laura, I will open up this first question for you. Is there any way to standardize the measurement of nitrous oxide per acre?
So if you're thinking about a measurement, I have to say, are you thinking about the way we calculate it? Or are you thinking about an actual in-field measurement? And so if you're thinking about an actual in-field measurement, then that gets really challenging because you're trying to figure out where is the best place to measure the nitrous oxide that's coming off the system. Is it the wet area, the dry area? It actually is variable. So there's the actual measurement, but I don't think that's what the person is asking. I think what they're really asking is how do we quantify it, using kind of model or standard systems. There are different levels of models that are available. If we go out, the broadest model that's there is somebody might just say, well, calculate your nitrogen application rate and multiply it times 0.01. And basically that gets you to your potential loss pathway. That's a pretty crude way of doing it. And so you can fine tune that a little bit, which is what we do. We fine tune that using USDA information, and we actually worked with Field to Market to implement the greenhouse gas, fertilizer, kind of nitrous oxide greenhouse gas metric into the field to market calculator. And that's what we're basing our calculations on. It is kind of an intermediate way to calculate nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide emissions are impacted by soil type, climate, moisture content, application rate, and then the different fertilizer practices that you can implement. And so that metric takes care of that or accounts for those. And so that's how we calculate it. If you want to go like all in and get the most certain number you can, then you can use something called DNDC. And the DNDC model is a very complex model that requires a lot of data inputs, and you might get your number a little closer to actual within 1 or 2%, but I think the intermediate way to calculate it's a pretty good way. And so there is a standard way, and you can see that within field to market. And the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium is using something that's somewhere between field to markets option and DNDC option. So we're always trying to balance how much data we actually have to collect from farmers to get a good estimate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. Going off of what you talked about earlier, you mentioned the 4R program. Michelle, I'll direct this question at you, but Laura, feel free to jump in if you've got anything to add. The 4R program that Laura spoke on earlier is obviously very important for the reasons that she mentioned, but what is being done to incorporate that program into the CSP or other NRCS programs?
Address that as a best management practice. You know, CSP, one of fertility issues are very significant there. People are very interested in split application, inhibitors, those types of things, as well as pest management. So those are all supported by CSP in some extent. And EQIP is a little bit different, but it's very popular in CSP.
Great. Laura, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that within the EQIP programs, essentially to be a management practice with an EQIP, you have to have a standard, a practice standard. And the nutrient management, we think of it as the 590 standard for NRCS, is the nutrient management standard. And the last time that was revamped or updated, we worked closely with USDA, and the 4Rs are built right into that. And so if you're interested in fertilizer best management practices, then, you know, if you want to go into your district conservation office, be asking about the 590 standard. That's the nutrient management standard. And similarly, several of the practices we're talking about, and in particular, enhanced efficiency fertilizers are within CSP if you're interested in that relative to air quality or water quality improvements.
Great. We've got a few questions, and I'm going to direct more towards Alex here. A little more legal questions. This one was thrown in the Zoom chat box, but they wanted you to share with us about the court ruling regarding lift stations.
That's a very broad topic. There is a lot of misconception about the propriety of lift stations. Many people see a lift station and instantly think that that can't or shouldn't be allowed or something like that. In reality, the lift stations are just another tool in a drainage infrastructure that assist in getting water to where it needs to go naturally. Now, you could structure a lift station in a way that doesn't put water where it should go naturally, and that's concerning. But there's many parts of the state that are very flat, and water goes where it's going to go naturally by gravity. There's some lift stations can be used to enhance that, but there's nothing wrong with them. There's a lot of misconceptions.
And obviously this panel was focused more so on water, and you brought up during your presentation both WOTUS and the Clean Water Act, and that one was obviously a big one that we saw the Trump administration roll back. What is your anticipation with how those issues are going to be handled under the Biden administration?
Well, I believe the Biden administration probably will extend well, maybe not actively extend, but the agencies that administer those rules will extend some of their jurisdiction. During the Trump administration, we saw places like the Corps of Engineers sort of pull back on certain regulations or not want to regulate things. You know, you provide them notice and then they choose to do nothing because they don't want to do anything. I anticipate that it's possible that with the new administration, they will undertake jurisdiction on certain things or want to have a seat at the table on for projects or for applications.
And going back even further, during the Obama administration, you know, the WOTUS rule, or what was defined as a navigable water, was defined quite down to, you know, a puddle or a stream. Do you anticipate that we will see that level of guidance underneath this new administration?
It's hard to know, but yeah, under the Obama administration, it was a quite encompassing rule, and it's been pulled back, and some states sued on that. I believe it'll probably they'll probably try to keep it or make it more broad, but there was some good blowback from the states on those issues to say, hey, we're the states, we're going to regulate our own thing. So I think they'll probably inch forward, maybe not as much as it did in the Obama administration.
And Laura and Michelle, although this panel is geared more towards talking about water in particular, this transition is quickly approaching, and I think that also poses a lot of questions for other environmental or things that might change under the new administration. I'll open this up to both of you as well. Within your areas of expertise, is there going to be anything that will change for agriculture under the new administration? Michelle, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not probably too good at forecasting things like that. However, usually the larger changes we see are as a result of a farm bill rather than a change in administration. So that's probably the short and sweet answer to that.
Fantastic. Laura, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would agree. The Farm Bill controls a lot of what we do within DC or, you know, across the country in agriculture at USDA. But there are certainly, like I mentioned in my talk as I was closing, you know, we do see some opportunities for increased engagement and increased support for agriculture, especially relative to the commitments that, you know, we'll be right back into when the administration takes us back into the COP, the Paris Climate Accord. The nitrogen, you know, a significant piece of the climate mitigation that was agreed to or committed to in our initial commitment, you know, 5 years ago, was relative to agricultural emissions. A significant piece of that was linked to nitrous oxide emissions. And, you know, anytime that we can get funding support, you know, for voluntary efforts to increase nutrient management practices that reduce loss pathways, in particular nitrogen loss pathways, that's a value for the farmer. Because, like I said, the economics and environmental outcomes of loss are somewhat tied together. I also think that we have, you know, we'll continue to see kind of this interest in ecosystem services market. How much of that is tied to the new administration, I'm not certain, other than seeing some of their transition documents and the potential support for a carbon market, or a carbon bank, sorry, within the commodity credit corporation that USDA manages. That's something that I've seen on the table. And then the other thing that we've heard is their potential openness to increasing some of the research dollars or recognition of the science and research that's needed to further advance and innovate within agriculture. We lost some of that in the last 4 years, and so the potential to kind of step up the research needs that we have. So, you know, everything, you know, you can find opportunities in everything if you go looking for them, and that's what we're planning to do.
Great, thank you, Laura. And we heard earlier from Dawn about weather. That obviously impacts commodity markets a lot, but it also impacts your jobs working in the environment as well as water more specifically. Turning to a little bit more deep question, and I'm not sure who wants to take this one first, but saline soils, what causes them and how do we do to prevent those?
Well, I could take a stab at that. That is quite a predicament, and we've seen a lot of that these past years, wet years. We've got a situation where obviously the salts move with water. When you've got water near the surface, those salts tend to wick up to the top of the surface and create those saline areas. It's more predominant in areas that see more row crops. So one of the best management practices to try and recover those areas is to plant it to permanent vegetation, something that's salt tolerant. So it is a challenge. We've seen those areas expand all across South Dakota the last number of years in areas where we hadn't seen them before. So it is a factor of water. And I don't know what these, potential droughts or drier conditions that might have some impact on that, but it is areas we are looking at, and obviously, like I mentioned earlier, we have some projects to try and help people address those areas.
Yeah, one of the, this is more of a technical science-based stuff, so I can pretend like I know what I'm talking about, I guess, but I know that drain tile does improve some of those areas as well. I mean, it's not a silver bullet by any means, but it can be a tool to get water moving away from those areas, and then also it breaks up the soil. Regarding some of the additional weather, the last couple of years have been almost unbelievable for a lot of people all across the state, and there may be some intermittent droughts, but I think the pattern of the last 30 years has been an increase in wetness, and a lot of that just has to do with the way nature works, and so I think the wetness topic is going to be here to stay. At least I'm banking on it as somebody that practices in that area, but I think it's going to be here to stay, and along with another mention was high commodity prices. That gives you more tools to invest in your fields to deal with that. And so there was 2012 very high commodity prices. A lot of drain tile went in those years because people could invest and afford it. If that stays the case, I imagine people will continue to do that.
Laura, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to stay away from the salt issue because I'm an agricultural engineer by training and not an agronomist. My agronomist friends would be like, why didn't you know that? You've been talking to us for 10 years now. But I'm not going to touch the salt issue. But I think relative to the increased rainfall patterns, I would just say that that's where we really need to look at what we can do to manage our loss pathways on the farm. And I think it's, we're seeing a lot of growth right now in the technology and innovation space, whether it is, bringing along additional fertilizer technologies that can help address some of those wet weather or risk, conditions, or if it's technology that allows us to predict better what's happening or understand in season better what's happening in the field. And as long as we're having these, extreme events that come late in the season after we have a lot of our nutrients down, we need to understand better what nutrients are still available, how much more the plant needs to get through the final growth stages when we get a late rainfall event like that. And I think there's research like that underway, and there is a lot of innovation and technology happening in private industry to further advance that. And I think we just have to keep being open to those and testing them out, doing some farm trials to try and better understand how you can reduce those. And really, measuring is knowing. It's not hard to calculate, the nitrogen balance or the nutrient use efficiency like we talked about today. If you don't understand how to calculate it yourself, ask your crop advisor. They can calculate it based on knowing your yields and knowing your application rates. And, understanding and tracking that in your own system is one easy way to try and get a hand on how you're actually doing on your own farm relative to your potential for nutrient loss. Because again, that is tied to economics and the environment. And in these wet weather years, our potential for loss increases. We always have a leaky system.
Great. Just a few more final questions here. Alex, I think this one should probably be directed at you to start, but again, anyone else, feel free to jump in. As Don was mentioning earlier, it seems that the long-term pattern might be pointing to more La Nina conditions, drier long-term. We've seen a lot of states out towards the western part of the country starting to deal with some water rights issues. There's a fight ensuing, it seems, for accessing ground, accessing water. Is that an issue that South Dakota is going to have to deal with, and at what point do you forecast that that will happen?
Sure. I think there is the water appropriation dispute is very prominent in Montana, Wyoming, those areas. A very large part of South Dakota has some of those geographic features, so where water is needed. I believe that the eastern half, East River, I don't believe that'll ever be a real issue to, if people need irrigator permits or if there's not enough water. It doesn't appear that that would be an issue, but that it was an issue in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and so I think the way the law is set up, there isn't really a structure for the appropriation of water. It's the common enemy doctrine where you got to get your water away. But it is an interesting issue that could arise in the western part of the state, I think.
Laura or Michelle, anything to add to that?
One thing that occurred to me, I believe there was an issue, they were looking at something like that with a facility proposed somewhere in the Mitchell area a few years back, and part of the permit application involved looking at their water use and use in a particular small aquifer. And I believe the state of South Dakota had to examine that and determine whether the aquifer could support that use. So it's probably quite unusual in eastern South Dakota since we tend to have more of an abundance of water than the western part of the state, but at times it can come up in other places.
Well, final question for everyone. Laura, I'll start with you. You all talked about some fantastic subjects and covered a lot of ground here in the past hour and a half. What are just, a simple take-home message or something that producers watching at home can take home and implement on their own operations?
I'd say, we've got some evidence to show that increasing kind of your intensity of management of your fertilizer use on your own farm has the potential to lead to some, benefits. As I showed some of the data, we can see improved nutrient balances. We can see improved nutrient use efficiencies. As we improve nutrient use efficiencies, we're generally achieving that through one of the components of achieving that is, reduced fertilizer use, reduced fertilizer application rates. And, that's an economic win for a farmer. And, as long as the yields are being optimized within that, and we are not seeing trailing yields as a result of the practice change that's occurring. And instead, we're seeing improvements in the efficiency and the uptake. So, take a look at what you're doing on your farm. Maybe consider some things that you could try this year. Go to the 4R Farming website, scroll down, use the questionnaire, answer a few questions about what you're doing on the farm, see if there's some new ideas that come up that maybe you want to talk to your crop advisor about implementing. I think the way that we stay current in the society and as a system is to continue evolving, and we kind of have to be looking for those new things that are on the horizon, and innovation and technology and better practices. That to me is the pathway. So explore it and see what you maybe can try on your farm this year.
Michelle, I'll turn it to you. What are some final messages or a take-home message producers at home watching should go home with?
All right. Well, just to tag on to Laura a little bit, we've seen folks really transition to precision ag over the last many years. That's certainly caught on and been more effective. We also have options for what we might call precision conservation, especially things like every acre counts and analyzing small areas to really look at profitability. So in addition to that, we do have a lot of folks that have really taken off with soil health practices. Some folks are kind of stepping into it with cover crops and then taking it to the next level. But anything you can do along the lines of soil health can help you relative to being more resilient in these weather extremes, whether it's too much water or not enough. The soil health systems really help balance that.
Great. And Alex, it's over to you.
Sure. From a water perspective only, and I'll keep it to that, the water has sort of forced its way into your life as a producer, one way or the other, and it's not every year. It's become, again, it's increasingly a topic of discussion, but it's also one of those things that if you get a couple dry years, it goes out of your mind. But everybody kind of remembers the last few years. Now is as good a time as any to make sure your water management practice, whether that's drainage or flood protection, is addressed, or you're working towards those steps. And one of the best ways that this can be done is you got your own farm, but you also have your own region. And the local control is something that I'm excited about for South Dakota, because there's a very unique opportunity to manage your area by the people in the area for flood control, drainage, those kind of things. And you can get a lot more done as a group than you can do on an individual basis. And it takes time, of course, and it's not easy, but it is possible. And there are some very good success stories out there of people that put that time in, and now they're reaping the benefits during these wet periods. And so the local control is something that is important.
Well, Laura, Alex, and Michelle, thank you all so much for joining us today. It was great to have you on as guests and panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are almost concluded with today's 34th Annual South Dakota Corn Growers Conference. I've got just a few final thoughts for us, as well as a few housekeeping items for today. But I think really a big take-home message, if I were to summarize what we learned today, is there are a lot of factors that we cannot control as producers. Like Don mentioned with weather, the cruises mentioned with commodity market prices, those are factors that are out of our control, as well as the transitioning administration. We don't know what's going to happen underneath all of those different things, and we can't control them as producers. So I think it's important to focus on what you can control, how to better your practice with environmentally sustainable practices on your operation. What can you do about water issues on your own farm? How can you make sure that you're marketing your crop at the most profitable levels? So those are all just a few things to consider, I think, and again, great messages from all of our speakers today. I want to give a big thank you to all of them for joining us here in South Dakota. A big thank you to all of you for tuning in at home. And really, you should be thanking your South Dakota Corn Growers Association as well. It sounds like a lot of great things were accomplished here during 2020. Even with COVID-19, we were able to get a lot done across the agricultural industry, including the passage of the USMCA trade deal and the Phase 1 trade deal, which has been very beneficial for commodity market prices as well as demand. We've also got to think back here in 2021, thinking back to 2020, what happened from the administration side of things. We saw the EPA dealing with a lot of renewable fuel waivers and fighting against folks on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, with oil refiners trying to get those small refinery waivers. And that, of course, impacted the business of ethanol, and more specifically, corn growers across the United States. We saw a lot of ethanol facilities shut down or idle during COVID-19, and we're starting to see some life sparked back into the commodity markets, and it's certainly an exciting time to be in agriculture here as we sit at the beginning of 2021. Other things to be excited for South Dakota corn growers in particular are the low carbon fuel standards, which have been pushed very heavily by, of course, South Dakota corn growers as well as others across the state, which could create premium markets for corn growers in South Dakota. Other notable action items that happened this year was the beginning of construction for the Raven Precision Ag Center at SDSU, as well as other research projects that included digestibility of DDGs. And we saw a lot of regulations change this year, including those that allowed the passage of grazing earlier on prevent plant acres. So although 2020 felt like it would never end, there is certainly a lot to be thankful for and reflect on here as we start things off with the new year. I want to thank once again all of our diamond sponsors for making this year's event possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without you, and we certainly couldn't have done it without all of you watching from home who made this year's event smooth sailing and bared with us through any sort of technical issues we had today, which thankfully was very minute. But thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to, again, South Dakota Corn Growers for putting on this fantastic event. That'll do it for this year's 34th annual conference.